Testing, testing, testing. It was all the way up when I got in.
I was trying to bring it up because I heard it's
Yeah.
down right now.
Well, and there's a border across the top now too. I don't know why that is, but
Is it
the
what?
slides go into it.
Yeah, well, it's pulled down too low, so it needs to just go up in here. I think.
But I don't know what that bar is across the top. That
It's just the
shadow.
black. See the white ends, and then the bar across the top is the black. It's just projecting higher on the screen. So it's where this should be.
I think you have to turn the little knob up there, but I need the bigger ladder.
Oh.
You have to turn a quarter turn up there, so it is what it is. Good morning. Triple duty. Turning on camera, running stream, running back and forth, doing this. I don't know if the streaming is since I can't see it, I hope all the audio's coming across, all the pictures coming across fine, so we're running blind, so at least everybody here is gonna get the presentation. That's the important thing. Let's begin this morning with a prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for this day, for the members that are here this morning. We thank you for your many blessings that you've given us throughout this past week. We ask that you be with those who are not able to be here. May you comfort them in their illness, help protect them in their illness, and be with those that need some strengthening and encouragement in their faith. We ask that you be with the study this morning, that we discuss everything that you would have us get out of your word, understand it properly, and present it appropriately. And we ask this in your Son's name. Amen. Okay, so hopefully I'm in the right chapter, beginning with chapter 11. It's, oh, okay, I guess we're good with the streaming. Everything goes so well sometimes when preparing the lesson, then when I'm all done, I'm like, am I doing the right chapter? I don't want to come in and do somebody else's part. So we're studying John chapter 11, as it says up there. And this will be the first week of the 2 weeks for this study. And to begin, we do want to go over the purpose of John, as we've been doing each and every week. And that comes from John 20 in verses 30 through 31. Many signs, therefore, Jesus also performed in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book, but these have been written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. And if we work backwards through these verses, we see that, and we're reminded and told that the overall purpose of John is so that we have eternal life. That's the ultimate end result. Life in his, Jesus' name. John believed it, and so he wants us to believe. But what is it that he wants us to believe? That Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. And through this book, John is ministering to us, and that's his goal. And but how do we believe what we're told to believe? And that is by John documenting Jesus' power here on earth, proving that he is God's Son. And so the book lists some of the many signs that Jesus performed. And so in John chapter 11, it's the famous story of Lazarus, probably well known. Everybody knows it. I don't intend to actually cover the raising of Lazarus and the miracle in part 1 of this study, because the whole first half of that chapter is leading up to that miracle. So we'll cover that in part 2 next week. But again, I've already given away the ending. I think it's safe to assume we know what that ending is. Raising Lazarus and bringing him back to life. This may seem off point for just a minute, but I promise it all circles back to the first verse and leads us right into John. But one of my favorite authors is Charles Dickens, and he was known for writing in a serial style. He would release chapters or parts of his story through pamphlets and periodicals, piece by piece, leading up to the end of the story. He was also known for some very famous first lines in his stories. I think, as I read these, you'll probably all recognize them, but it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. And that's only the first 12 words of a 115 long first sentence. Another one, once upon a time, it matters little when. And there are many others, but just like that first line from A Tale of Two Cities, he was also known for long first sentences, and so I don't want to hold us up. His most famous work, of course, is probably A Christmas Carol. And it is one of my favorite stories, but not because of the gazillion movie and TV adaptations out there, because you see it every year and constantly have it on your mind. But I liked his writing style and his storytelling. And while everyone may be familiar with the story itself, you may not be familiar with the actual first line of the book. And that is, Marley was dead to begin with. And then a few sentences later, he continues, this must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come of the story I am going to relate. Now, obviously, the book of John came long before Charles Dickens, but the chapter 11 could have begun in the same way. Lazarus was dead to begin with. And then following with his own version of that, it could have also read, this must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come of the story I'm going to relate. So let's begin in John 11, verse 1. We see, obviously, right away, we see the first name, or we see the name of Lazarus. So being familiar with that story and the miracle associated with him, verse 1 pretty much gives us and brings us into that sign that we're about to be told. And while verse 1 begins by informing us Lazarus is sick, by the time the news reaches Jesus in verse 3, Jesus responds in verse 4, knowing that Lazarus is or will soon be dead. And so that begins our story. These opening verses reintroduce us to Mary, her sister Martha, and of course their brother Lazarus, and they're residing in the village of Bethany. And we've read other references to the village itself and to Mary and Martha in Matthew 21. It mentions that Jesus went down to Bethany, and Luke 10 tells us the story of Jesus being invited into the home of Mary and Martha. And so Moving on then to verse 5, we're told that Jesus loved them. It doesn't say, let me just go ahead and read that one. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Now it doesn't say simply Jesus loved just one of them or more than the other. John actually spells out that Jesus loved all three of them and mentions them as individuals. I'm assuming because of that, that John is emphasizing that each person in this family was important to Jesus in their own way. And as we read further on, we discover there's a friendship, a closeness, and a connection. Also, I assume, because John, I've mentioned before when I was doing chapter 5, John is very blunt and to the point in many instances. He kind of cuts to the point. And so because of that, I assume that there were other meetings between Jesus and Mary, Martha, and Lazarus that may not be mentioned in the Bible, only because maybe those stories weren't important to the Gospels being told at the time, but the fact that we're thrown into the knowledge of this close relationship that Jesus had and the love for them, there must be more to the story. Again, an assumption. And because of that, because we're getting that hint of a relationship and the bond that Jesus has with these three individuals, John uses the first half of chapter 11 to give us some real deep insight into Jesus, who he is, his character, and it allows us to get us to know him deeper. And so by saving that miracle and putting it off till the second half of the chapter, John provides us with the reminder that while Jesus is the one and only Son of God, he was also very much a human who lived among us, and we all know, for a very specific purpose. Obviously, he had friends. He had close relationships. He felt love. There was more to Jesus in his life than maybe what we do read in the Scriptures. The Scriptures aren't a daily account of his life. They're not telling us minute by minute, day by day. So, again, I would assume there's some pieces that take place that maybe just weren't important to the Gospels. But Jesus had a full life. He lived a full life. He experienced joy, happiness. Probably comfort with those friends. And we'll get to some more of these qualities and keep discussing the qualities as we go on. Are there any comments so far up to this point, knowing that there's still more and we're building to it?
Yeah, one of the things that, when you have relationships, you are making yourself vulnerable. It's one thing when you want to do something or allow certain events to take place or whatever the way Jesus does here, and you're disconnected from what's happening. It's another thing to, it's one thing to, like, for instance, he was walking down the street, he sees this widow and her son died, he had compassion on her and raised her son, but he didn't necessarily know that widow or have a relationship with her or have foreknowledge that her son was going to die and delay while he didn't. It was more of a detached story. But here it's a intimate thing. It's my best friends, and one of my friends that's dying, and other friends who are going to look at me and say and have a faith crisis because he says that I'm the Lord, and yet you could have helped, you could have prevented this, and you didn't. And so it's different when it's someone you care about. I just think it shows Jesus made himself vulnerable, and he didn't protect himself from that pain. He walked through it, and it shows his humanity and also his willingness to suffer for God's sake.
And yeah, that's another take an observation on that relationship too is, you know, we know when we open ourselves up to certain emotions, like love, for instance, we're also setting ourselves up to be hurt, maybe. You know, either losing that person or maybe the loss of the relationship itself. Mike?
I think going in kind of a sideways direction from what Steve started is by opening yourself up. Look what he did with Judas. I mean, there's probably one of the few things that is heartfelt, devastating, is to have a friend betray you. And in Jesus' case, no one knew who that person was, but yet there's no indication he treated him any different than the other apostles. He, you know, in fact, he trusted him with the money pouch and whatnot, even knowing the type of person he was, and he gave him every opportunity not to be that person. And that at the end, he knew he was going to be betrayed by him. And again, that's something that really hurts. And most of us, if we're put in that situation, then no, I'm not even going to allow this to happen. But yet Christ let it, because of course, it was part of the thing that had already been prophesied was going to happen. But still, he opened himself up to that kind of pain.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, there's so much you can connect to the importance of him being here, living among us with us. It wasn't easy for him either. The same emotions and pain that we go through. So I want to back up just a second and go to verse 4 and 6. When Jesus is informed of Lazarus' condition, his reaction may be perplexing based on what we read. He's proclaiming that Lazarus's death is an opportunity to show God's glory, and that he himself, as the Son of God, may be glorified in this death. And instead of rushing off to comfort Mary and Martha in their grief, like maybe some of us might have done, or someone who loves someone deeply would do, he stays put for another couple of days. The scripture is very specific, mentioning in a couple of places here amount of days that go by. We actually cover this a little later, so I'll just hold off on the questions or comment at this point. But just because we started late, I want to make sure we get through it all. So we already know Jesus, again, knowing the ending, we know that Jesus plans to use this event for God's glory, and we know what he's going to do. Again, we'll get to this in a second. I'll come back to that. And so we do get to a couple of possible reasons why he waited here coming up. And then moving into verses 7 through 10, just as surprising as it can be that we're reading that Jesus decides to do nothing immediately for Lazarus and his two sisters, and 2 whole days go by, then suddenly, right away in verse 7, he's announcing, or he's telling his disciples, "I'm ready. Let's go to Judea." And this prompts a concern and a warning from his disciples. Remember, the Jews are seeking to kill you. Obviously, that's so brief and so quick. There's no details provided in this passage how Jesus spent those 2 days, what they did. But again, we kind of assume and think that what may have taken place, maybe the conversations, the disciples may have been anxious, knowing that Lazarus was sick. It must have been serious because they sent his sister sent a message to Jesus. So I would assume, again, there's maybe some anxiety, some worry. Maybe there was some concern why Jesus was waiting, but they also understood he couldn't leave because if he left, he could be in danger. And we see, kind of matter-of-factly, that it sounds anyway, that Jesus is remaining calm. Again, he has a purpose. We know that he loved the family deeply and cared, but still his actions, the perplexing part might be his actions don't seem to reflect that. And then suddenly Jesus announces, let's go to Judea. And so he wants to walk right into the lion's den, where we know that he could be stoned upon sight. And so now there's a different kind of anxiety that the disciples could be feeling. And so now they're worried about going and what they're walking into. And we've seen this before throughout the scriptures. We've seen that many examples of the disciples are always on edge. They're always questioning what and why Jesus is doing what he's doing, and why Jesus himself doesn't show a sense of urgency where you and I might think, where you and I might be. We might be showing that. Does this in any way relate to the many messages that Jesus has given on patience, being anxious for nothing? God does all things in his time. And doesn't it, show faith in God when we don't have that, when we don't have that anxiety and act upon it? Another thing, could Jesus have cured Lazarus long distance? Could he have cured Lazarus from where he was? We just read a few chapters ago in chapter 4 how Jesus cured the nobleman's son when the nobleman's son was about to die. So kind of a similar situation. And without ever seeing or being near the boy, Jesus was able to tell the nobleman, go back home. Your child lives. And the nobleman was even able to verify the time that his son recovered and compared it and matched it to the time that Jesus said, your son will live. So we know it can be done. Jesus could have acted even without going into Bethany. In the next section, 11 through 16, now maybe we learn one of the reasons why Jesus didn't act quickly, or maybe why he remained calm, is that Lazarus was indeed already dead. There was no point in rushing to his side in order to prevent that. Jesus informs his disciples, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, which for them is too vague of a statement. They think Lazarus is resting, Lazarus is sleeping, and so he will recover and get well. But Jesus confirms what we knew all along, and as well as his plans for Lazarus all along. But I go that I may awaken him out of sleep. And then Jesus has to plainly tell the disciples that Lazarus is dead. And then we come across another maybe perplexing statement. Here, Jesus says something, or Jesus says, I'm glad that Lazarus is dead, and it's for your sakes that I was not there. If Jesus had been there, he would have been enticed or maybe compelled to cure Lazarus. But now that he stayed away and wasn't there, allowed everything to take its course, so that you may believe. So now Jesus can perform an even greater miracle, or something that would seem even more. We'll get into more of the level of miracles in chapter or part 2 next week. But now it's something that's going to be even more wondrous for people to witness. And so he turns the death around again into something that is going to be great and wonderful. And just the wording. I'm glad he died for your sake. And so, during this conversation, Jesus now convinces his disciples, or that yes, we're going to go to Judea, and Thomas even turns to his fellow disciples and says, let us go that we may die with him. Given that we're not told that some stayed behind, we're not told that all went with him, but we know that Jesus had a purpose in this death to show them something. We assume that they all then went with Jesus and they all followed him. And so we're gathering more qualities of Jesus. he, he's not just a man living among us, but he's also a prophet. Without being told or given additional messages that we're aware of, he knew that Lazarus had died. The fact that the disciples didn't know that Lazarus had died, I would also assume means that he didn't get additional messages, no other word came. So the fact that Jesus knows what has happened, that now, we're seeing Jesus the prophet. Jesus has the power to persuade and lead. There must be either something very comforting in his voice or comforting in his manner, that people will even follow him to their own death. We see that Jesus can inspire great love and devotion from his disciples and those around him, again, wanting to follow him into an unsafe place. We learn a little bit more about the disciples, their faith in Jesus, their love for Jesus, and their love in addition for Lazarus and Mary. Back in verse 11, Jesus referred to Lazarus as our friend. So we can also assume that maybe the disciples too had a close relationship with these three. Are there any, I know I'm moving along quick and not reading the verses in order to get through it all, but are there any comments maybe up to this point?
Question is, did he and throughout the other Gospels, was this the first timeline that he had raised someone from the dead? Because he had raised other people from the dead.
Again, to some of the comments coming up, I guess I stick to the emphasis that nobody expected it. Nobody thought of it.
Yeah.
Nobody remembered it.
But
Nobody.
had anybody of his disciples or anybody witnessed him raising anyone from the dead prior to Lazarus?
I don't know.
Dead, but it was like the widow of Nain. He did that prior to this.
Okay.
But
Well, I think the message we're getting is that he waited so that those who witnessed it, that would have benefited their faith the most.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
And
healing men before he died, I think that had a big impact on all those that witnessed it, and then increased their faith even that much more.
And if all or some or a couple of them witnessed other instances, yeah, that I don't know who was there, but it doesn't come up, which again kind of plays into some things I say in a minute. But
well, two things. One is, even though Jesus had fed a multitude of people once before, the disciples didn't expect it when he did it again. So they're not just thinking he's willy-nilly just dealing out miracles, so they don't expect him to do it, but when he does, they're grateful. And the second thing is with Lazarus, he was dead when the word got to Jesus. So it wasn't that he died after Jesus got the message, because if you just do the math, it was 4 days he had been dead.
mm-hmm.
If he waited 2 days and it took 2 days to get there, that's 4 days. If he waited 2 days and it took 1 day to get there, then Lazarus had died a day before they arrived to him. So, when Jesus got word, Lazarus was dead. There were people coming from Jerusalem out to see him where he was. At the end of chapter 11, it says that. So for him to just dismiss everybody, say, I know you traveled 2 days to get here, but you go home. I have something to deal with. I got a personal matter. He took care of the people who were there, and then he moved on because Lazarus was dead. And I read, in the Jewish mind, the body began to decay after 4 days. So 3 days, there was no decay. 4 days was the day the spirit left the body. That's kind of was their lore anyway.
Mm-hmm.
But when Jesus was in the grave for 3 days and he didn't rot, that was part of the Jewish understanding of the body starts to rot on the 4th day. When he arrived at Lazarus, they said, it's already rotten. And raising a rotten body from the dead is different than raising a recently deceased body from the dead, and that was significant in the eyes of the Jews.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mike?
I think
And then
that
Bruce.
I think that was one of the key things about it is Jesus knew that through whatever things that happened in the past or whatnot, that people have a tendency to kind of explain things away. He removed all doubt. He made sure that there was not going to be somebody out there saying, oh, well, Lazarus was just in a coma or he was sick. He wasn't really dead.
Mm-hmm.
And he just got better. Jesus made this an obvious case where there was no doubt. And everybody that was there knew it. There was not going to be an argument. And even though the Pharisees and whatnot that wanted to kill him admitted that he came raising from the dead.
Mm-hmm.
To the point that they wanted to kill both of them. We're just great about thinking that way.
Mm-hmm. Bruce?
He raised Jairus' daughter from the dead. He was an official in the synagogue, and that happened, I believe, before this event with Lazarus. It happened before the feeding of the 5,000. So if you have a chronological timeline, it looks like Jairus' daughter was raised before Lazarus. So somebody, the apostles primarily, knew that that was going to happen. I mean, they had the mourners in the house, in the room where the girl had passed away, and Jesus says, you know, this is not unto permanent death. And they all laugh at him, you know,
Mm-hmm.
they make fun of him and so on. So he chases them out and raises her from the dead.
And going into what Steve said too, I was also reading regarding a tradition that was believed, and that was the soul of the body would hang around the grave for up to 3 days. And it was interesting when he said about 3 days and the body starts to decompose, that you can see a connection with that timeline, that there still may be a possibility that the person could recover or come back if the soul decides to return to the body according to the tradition. But then after that third day, well, now the body is decomposing, falling apart, and there's just no way somebody could come back. Raising the other instance that you mentioned, it's almost maybe a fresher death, an earlier death. Maybe that miracle was easier to believe because maybe it wasn't a miracle, it was something more natural according to the traditions. Whereas this, we're seeing several days go by. He was in the tomb for 4 days, but how long had he been dead before he was placed in the tomb? Did a day or two pass there, possibly?
He was good to death.
So the days are very specifically mentioned in this chapter, and so by the time Jesus does get to Lazarus, enough days has passed, enough mourning has taken place that hopefully all doubt has been removed that Lazarus is dead. And I think we covered that. And then in verse 20 to 27, Jesus has arrived just outside of Bethany. We find out that he hasn't quite come into the village yet, but Martha hears that he's nearby, runs out to meet him, and we don't know the full conversation, or if there was any full conversation other than what's written down here. But we're told that Martha greets Jesus by saying, "If you had been here, you could have saved my brother." One of the commentaries I was reading said it would be interesting to know the tone at which these were spoken. We see, and I'll start jumping around ahead too, but Mary eventually, Martha goes back home, tells Mary. Mary runs out to see Jesus. Mary confronts Jesus with this exact same wording, almost to the point. If you had been here, Jesus, or if you had been here, you could have saved my brother. And so I don't know if there was maybe a difference in tone between the two, because Jesus responds to Martha by reminding her, Martha expresses her faith in him by saying, I know whatever you ask of God, God will give you. She still believes that he is Jesus. She still believes he can do anything. Jesus has a further conversation with her talking about, I will raise your brother, and Martha says, yeah, I know he will come again on the last day, but Jesus is emphasizing something else, obviously, and reminds her, I am the resurrection and the life, and he who believes in me dies. So there's a little more conversation with Martha. We know that her faith hasn't wavered, but, again, was her tone maybe very disappointed, or, why did it take so long for Jesus to come? We know that they knew where he was. The message got to him. Did they assume that he would have been there within a day instead of, 2, 3, 4 days later? So, is there some doubt that maybe he didn't get there as quick as he could have, knowing where he was? Mary, on the other hand, when she rushes out to see Jesus, she falls at his feet, or at least that's what we read. Maybe her tone was much different. Her tone was maybe anguish and sad, and maybe there was a difference between how Mary said what she said and how Martha said what she said, because of how Jesus responded. When Mary ran out to Jesus, or when Martha ran out to Jesus, we just hear that she went out to him, and we assume she went alone. When Mary went out to Jesus, all the mourners followed her out there. So now Jesus is seeing maybe more anguish from Mary falling at his feet. He's also seeing everybody else, all the mourners, weeping. And now, instead of talking to Mary about her faith, we read that Jesus is troubled and overcome by the sight of the weeping and the mourning. And so there's a different response between the two women said the exact same thing, but there's a different response. So I wonder if there may be something to that about the tone, or how they said it, and maybe what they said, or how they said it.
What I thought was interesting is verse 22 from Martha. But even now, I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you. To me, I totally misread that. It sounds that she believes that Christ can raise Christ, or raise Lazarus. And that, to me, that's a statement that indicates that, I don't know what else I could refer to, but even with that, then the following verses after that kind of question it. So I've always kind of found that an interesting statement.
The best explanation I could come to and find and in reading was this: by saying, Jesus, I know whatever you ask of God, God will give you, is her way of saying, I still believe you to be the Son of God, I still believe you to work through God. But then when she says, when Jesus says, I will raise Lazarus, right, to her response, he says, your brother shall rise again. Now she's referencing, in the day of the resurrection, the last day. So she's almost not thinking he will or can. That's why I think maybe she's just exclaiming her faith. Steve?
It's interesting, the different, they obviously were talking, the sisters, if Jesus had been here.
Right.
Well, she says, even now, even after all this happened, I still believe. I still think you can do something. Maybe not for Lazarus, but you still are from God, even now. To me, it's like there's a crisis of faith in there to some extent. Right? She's questioning now. Like, you have to think, well, no, he said it would be fine. It's fine. She doesn't have that kind of faith anymore. She has you failed me, but even now. Almost like, you're not as strong as I thought you were. You're not as loving. You're not as involved. She's qualifying it a little bit. Mary goes up and says, if you'd have been here, you could have taken him. But since you weren't here, like, you have to be here for it to work. And when you see that, and everyone mourning and grieving, Jesus is witnessing Satan's attack, not on him, but on the people he holds dear. And you see him furious about it. When it says he's deeply moved, the Greek word means furiously angry. He sees Satan causing a faith crisis, and even though, I didn't deal with it, but he did say it was going to be okay. It wasn't going to end in death. He sent that message back to them, but his word wasn't enough. You know, they got the message after Lazarus had died and said, well, if he knows everything, if he's God, how could this prophecy have failed? And so you see a faith crisis here.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also, Jesus is using it to build their faith, but they have to see and truly trust that he's from God.
And there's an element of, yes, I have faith in you, Jesus, because had you been here, you could have saved him. But there's a lack of faith in thinking, well, you could still save him, or you could have done something, or still can do something. So there's kind of a, yeah, I believe you are who you are, and you could have done it, but I'm very disappointed in you, and yeah, the faith is wavering, or.
And when the messenger returns and says, Jesus said it's not going to end in death. And, you know, how do you respond to that? Well, that's not true.
Mm-hmm.
Could have been true.
Molly?
I guess part of what has always jumped to my mind during this section is, where's that thy will not mine be done attitude? Where's that acceptance of the will of God? You know, they just assumed that Christ would have healed Lazarus had he been there. And yes, he's been healing a lot of people, but he hasn't been healing, you know, it's not like he went boom, the whole world was all healthy and well. And I understand that they both are believers, and this may be a crisis of faith, but, you know, the thing that's missing in this is, you know, God's will has been done.
And get my thought back. And we see that he told his disciples that yes, he died, but it's for your sake, because now you're going to be witness to something great. We don't know if he said the same thing to Mary and Martha. We're just, you know, we assume not, because it's not there, but you know, maybe the disciples again were let in on something, a hint as to what was about to happen, where Mary and Martha are still in their grieving and wavering phase. And then we get to verse 35, and I remember a lesson years ago that Ron was giving when he was talking about this story. And while I've always been aware of the verse and its significance and relevance, I just never heard it put this way, that it's the shortest verse in the Bible. And that struck me, that, you know, two simple words, a short verse, and how powerful it is in letting us know who Jesus is. Weeping or wept, because we do, you know, reading into the language, we understand that weeping means wailing and shrieking, and that was also a tradition of how mourners showed their honor and grief to the deceased, whereas Jesus wept. And the wept, does that mean feeling pain? Does it mean shedding tears? There was anger, feeling troubled. All of those emotions were in there. And then we associate, we as humans or people, we associate emotions like laughter, feelings of love, tears, all those things. Those always are things that we say that make us human, and now we're seeing another trait or another action that Jesus takes that tells us he's human.
Two things. In verse 40, Jesus says to Mary and Martha, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" That's why I associate when it says Jesus said, "This is the end of death, but in the glory of God."
Mm-hmm.
That was the message he sent back to them. And when he got to them, he rebuked them by saying, "Didn't I tell you this?"
Okay.
So that's where I get that. And then as far as with this Jesus wept, I heard someone teaching on this, it was impactful to me, because Jesus didn't have to enter into their grief. But because he is our example of love, he did not shield himself from grief. He entered into the grief of Mary and Martha and shared that with them, even though he knew, in an hour he's going to be alive, everything will be fine. He didn't let that separate him from the people he loved. Sometimes we might put up a shield knowing it'll be better in a minute, but he didn't do that. He entered into their grief. He experienced it with them genuinely, and he love them, so he wouldn't be separated from them. And that really shows what true love looks like.
Mhm.
And I think it also demonstrates something that is common to us. When one of our children suffered a heartbreak of some sort, and I say relatively young, we feel a sadness for them, even though that we know, hey, 2 weeks from now, this ain't gonna mean nothing to you. But right now, it's very hurtful to you. And we will show compassion and mercy for that child. And we, like Steve said, we will let their pain affect us and give us pain. And I think, again, it just shows the humanity of Christ and the fact that he was perfect in all ways. And as an example to us on how we are, how God made us, how we were created to be, and also the idea of rising above the faults and the failures and everything else. And it just, to me, it's just the whole thing combined there is kind of demonstrated in his humanity.
Thank you for that. And we'll close this morning with the last two verses, again, leading up to Jesus reaching the tomb. And so in closing, these last two verses also are pointing out that whatever Jesus was feeling, whatever emotions he had, they're not going unnoticed. The crowd notices how he loved him. So there must be some very deep expression of love that they can witness to know that Lazarus meant something to Jesus very, very importantly. But then again, we see the continuing trend that had he only been here, he could have saved him. If Jesus could cure the blind, couldn't he have raised Lazarus? Couldn't he have cured Lazarus? Then it brings us back to maybe why Jesus did delay, why he did wait in coming into Bethany, because of right now, everyone there in that moment, we see in this crowd, everyone there, and what has been said up to now, they have no doubt that Lazarus was dead to begin with, as we began. And we leave this morning knowing that this has to be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful will come of the story that we finish next week. And so I'll leave it there, but if there's any closing comments, we can close out with that. Oh, okay, thank you very much.